This is Learning About the Roman Liturgy with Louis Tofari, the rubrics, the liturgy, the traditions of the Roman Catholic faith. And now, here's Louis Tofari.
Hello and welcome to Learning About the Roman Liturgy. I'm your host, Louis Tofari of Romanitas Press. Last week we had talked about the pall. The pall, of course, eventually developed out of the single corporal itself. Originally there was a corporale minus, which was used to cover the host, and then this became the corporal used to cover the chalice, which became known as the pall. And originally the pall's name was corporale quo calix tegitur, the corporal which covers the chalice. Pope Benedict the 14th, he died in 1758. He wrote a kind of famous liturgical work called De Sacrosancto Missae Sacrificio. And in there, this is the term that he gives to this. And it seems even at one time that the corporal that became the pall, it actually was a folded over piece of linen, extremely heavily starched so it could be as stiff as possible. And but at one time they weren't always using linen for the pall. Sometimes they were using a piece of fabric stuff. That was a term that they would use. It's still used by some people. And this could be made out of silk. It could have been something finely embroidered. Later, of course, they began to insist that the pall be of pure linen, just like the corporal. Now, in the strict sense, the pall is a rectangular shape of linen. They oftentimes think it's going to be folded into a square, and it's very heavily starched to keep it stiff, but slightly flexible. There's some pictures you can see from like illuminated manuscripts or even paintings where you can see a pall and the corners of the pall actually droop down a little bit on the edges there, and that's because the starch could only make it only so stiff. Today, it's very common to see palls that are made basically of two rectangular pieces, about 5 inches square, if not a little more. And these pieces have been stitched together with a piece of cardboard or even plastic inside. And this keeps them very stiff, though they still, of course, will starch that linen very heavily, especially because the side that actually touches the cup of the chalice or lip of the chalice, so that way it won't become stained. It accidentally come into contact with the precious blood. So the other thing about the pall is it needs to be large enough in its shape so it'll stay on top of the chalice. So again, 5 to 6 inches square is usually what you'll see. The underside of the pall must always be of plain linen. And also, if you're going to have a piece of cardboard or plastic inserted, there needs to be a way so you can take that out. So if the linen has to be purified, you can wash it completely. The upper side of the pall, though, may have decorations on it. It can be of plain linen, or it can have colored embroidery. It can be a fabric applique of silk. It can be cloth of gold or silver or some other color. It can have attached gems or pearls or a painted illustration. You can see a lot of different examples of this if you were to do a Google search on palls. There's some also very beautiful examples if you were able to find some of the ones that were used at the papal mass on the chalice. Even under Pope John Paul II in the new mass, they had this very beautiful decorated pall. It probably dates back to even earlier, probably under Pius XII or something is when this was actually made. The pall also may have the hems trimmed with a thin band of lace. Now, as we mentioned earlier with the corporal, since the pall was originally part of the corporal, it takes on the same blessing from the Rituale Romanum. Okay, now let's move on to the third chalice linen, which is the purificator. Now, the word purificator is derived from the Latin word to purify or to cleanse. It's also been called the mundatori or purificatori, and the reason for this is it is essentially a napkin or towel, and it has simply a utilitarian purpose, which is to wipe out the chalice in preparation for the offertory. So just before the priest pours in the wine and the water, he'll wipe out the chalice with the linen purificator. At a solemn mass, it would be the deacon who would do that. The purificator is also used to safeguard against spillage when pouring cruet. So they'll actually hold the purificator folded over the fingers against the lip of the chalice, and actually hold the cruet over that purificator, so to prevent it from dripping on the altar or onto the chalice itself. As I mentioned earlier, it's used to partially cover the paten with the corporal until the embolism, or the libera me, when the paten is brought out again for the place to host on after the fraction. And like I said before, the humeral veil replaces this usage at solemn masses. The purificator is used to wipe off the paten during the embolism, which that's the fancy word that's given to the part where, as the priest prays the Libera Me after the Our Father, he holds the paten with the purificator in his hands, and then he actually signs himself. And he actually, just before he does that, he wipes off the paten with the purificator to make sure it's completely clean before he puts the host on there. At solemn mass, what's really interesting is the deacon actually holds the paten between the purificator, and he kisses the paten and then gives it to the priest, who then touches it with his bare hands. And the deacon, just before that, has actually wiped off the paten with the purificator for the celebrant. The purificator is also used during the ablutions for as he consumes the water and the wine that was poured over the fingers and into the chalice, so to prevent any spillage there. And then, of course, it's used to cleanse and dry the chalice, or even the ciborium, after communion. So again, another reason why it's important that the purificator be made out of pure linen, because it won't scratch the gilding. There's something I neglected to mention. It's not an actual rubric, but it's usually done, is during the offertory. So after they've poured in the wine and the water into the chalice, the celebrant or the deacon at solemn mass will actually take the purificator and wipe out the inside of the cup of the chalice to make sure that there isn't anything adhering, so everything's all the liquid is in the same spot, and that's again done to prevent any spillage. So that's just another little interesting thing that happens, another kind of careful thing that's being done in regards to the contents of the chalice. Now, originally the purificator was a maniple. It was a very long and thin napkin or handkerchief. And it seems that from antiquity, this was at first how the purificator was actually carried. The first evidence seems to be from that of Pope Saint Sylvester I, who prescribed its use for priests and deacons, and it was to be worn on the left hand. And this was originally jealously guarded as a Roman privilege. It was only to be done in the Eternal City of Rome, which eventually, of course, others began to adopt. And the thing was that the purificator was used for wiping out the chalice. And eventually out of this developed the maniple itself. So the maniple was a handkerchief. In this particular case, this handkerchief was being used for wiping out the chalice. There's an interesting picture of an ancient papal mass, and the Pope is actually wearing two maniples. He's wearing one of decorated cloth and another very long, thin one, which appears to be made of linen. So it seems that maybe at one point there was even a time when there were two maniples being worn. The first one was of this decorative handkerchief, which was kind of a status symbol in the ancient world. Kind of like, how you see men when they're wearing a fancy suit coat and they have that fancy handkerchief tucked into their suit coat vest pocket. So that kind of idea there. And then, of course, they had this other maniple, which was actually the purificator, which is actually used for wiping out the chalice. Now, again, the purificator must be of pure linen. It should be about 12 to 18 inches long and about 9 to 10 inches wide. So it's rectangular in shape. It's folded in 3 layers, And like I said before, customarily, it's not required, but they usually see it where they iron a wedge crease into the purificator so it'll more easily stay on the chalice cup. So that's a nice little thing to do. Usually it's marked with a cross in the center to distinguish it from the actual finger towel or lavabo towel. It's not absolutely required to do this, but it's very customary to see it. The purificator actually should not be starched, unlike the corporal or the pall, because it needs to be able to absorb. That's its purpose. So you don't generally want to starch that. And it doesn't necessarily have to be blessed because it has a utilitarian purpose, but generally speaking they are, and there is a specific blessing for that. Well, we're going to take a break now, and we're going to come back and continue discussing the chronology of the development of the chalice linens, and then some other linens that are used in the liturgy. And so we'll be back here in just a few minutes.
Stephen Cox talks politics and the faith.
And the Enlightenment's not even the right word for it. It's more appropriately titled the Endarkenment. Because what we're doing is politics without God.
Every Friday, it's Church and State here on Magnificat Radio at 10 a.m., 1 p.m., and 8 p.m.
The true gospel, the gospel of the Catholic Church, needs to be promoted instead of this general, vague, and hazy brotherhood between Jews, Catholics, Muslims, and Protestants of all denominations.
That's Church and State with Stephen Cox every Friday at 10 a.m., 1 p.m., and 8 p.m. Central Time, U.S.
We have a lot of things in store, a lot of stuff going on.
Here on Magnificat Radio at magnificatmedia.com, living our traditional Catholic faith.
Thank you for listening to Magnificat Radio, living our traditional Catholic faith. Merci d'écouter Magnificat Radio, la radio des traditionnels catholiques.
So, welcome back to learning about the Roman liturgy. So before we continue our discussion about some of the other linens that are used in the liturgy, let's make a quick review the historical development of the chalice linens. So we start in the early church with a throw-over type of altar cloth that was used simultaneously as not only the top covering for the altar, but also it was used as the corporal and the pall. Around 335 AD, we have Pope St. Sylvester I, who prescribes at Rome the use of linen for the altar cloth, which is also the corporal. So previous to this, the corporal could have been made of silk because it was the altar cloth or some other fabric. Pope St. Sylvester also prescribed the use of the mapula, which is the derivative for today's maniple, which was that linen handkerchief, and it was used as a purificator. During the Carolingian period, between 700 to 800 AD, the altar cloth and the corporal become separated into two distinct pieces. And at this time, the corporal is still about the length of an altar cloth itself. Moving on to between 800 and 900 AD, we now have three altar cloths being adopted for use at Rome. But other places still continue to use two cloths. Some places even made use of four cloths. We'll talk about what that fourth cloth is a little bit later here. And the low mass form is now being introduced, and so the pall is gradually being developed from the corporal as a distinct piece to cover the chalice. Now we enter into the period of the Middle Ages from about 1000 to 1300 AD. And the size of the corporal is gradually being reduced. The corporale minus, which is the corporal developed to cover the host, comes into use and then gradually becomes defunct. In 1502, the corporal is now square in size and folded down to carry within a burse. And this is what's outlined in the Missale Romanum. So this is what's being done in Rome at this time. The pall is now a stiffened square, which is large enough to fit over the chalice cup. And the purificator is a rectangular napkin and specially folded and carried on the chalice. So what we are used to seeing today really becomes formalized here in the 16th century in the city of Rome. And then, of course, by 1570, with the codification of the Missale Romanum, or altar missal of the Roman Mass, this then gradually becomes the universal practice for everywhere where the Roman Mass is offered. Now we're going to talk real quick about the special purification of the chalice linens. Now, the chalice linens are very different than the altar cloths in the respects that they actually do come into contact with the sacred species. The altar cloths would only come into contact by accident, meaning that if the precious blood in the chalice were to accidentally be spilled over during the Mass, and they would have to absorb it. Okay, but otherwise, the altar cloths aren't actually made to necessarily come into contact with the sacred species. And this is very practical too, because it's far easier to clean a corporal in a special manner than to clean an entire long altar cloth. Now, to start out with, this is the purification method of these chalice linens, of the corporal, the pall, and the purificator, is mentioned during the bishop's admonition to the subdeacons who are about to be ordained. So this is from the subdiaconate ordination rite itself. Quote, "The cloths which are used for the covering of the altar must be washed in one vessel, the corporals in another. Where the corporals have been washed, no other linen is to be washed, and the water must be poured into the baptistry. Endeavor, therefore, to perform these material services properly and with careful attention, and in a like manner to fulfill the spiritual obligations symbolized by them." Unquote. A couple things come to relief here. We talked about in our last show how the altar linens have this intimate connection with the subdeacon. The subdeacon, it's one of his main duties. They have care of the altar cloths. There's many other symbolisms related to that. The altar cloths represent the faithful, that if the faithful are to become soiled, they are to be cleansed with the water of doctrine that the subdeacon must minister, because the subdeacon is... It's assumed the subdeacon is going to be washing the altar cloths. That rarely happens today. Of course, now, generally speaking, it's the ladies of altar societies that take care of this. Here they're talking about, the altar cloths. They're talking about the corporals. And here, when they're talking about the corporals, they're also including the palls, because, of course, the pall was a corporal once upon a time. And they're talking about the purificators as well. And so this is kind of interesting. First thing, they talk about that the altar cloths are washed in one vessel. And this is because, again, they just need to be washed. In fact, today, altar cloths don't even get a special washing unless they've accidentally come into contact with the sacred species. Then they would have to be washed like a corporal, which I'll talk about in a moment here. But generally speaking, the altar cloths are simply removed from the altar, turned over to the ladies, and then they wash them specially. However they do that. They may do it by hand. They may put it in a washing machine. And then they press them, all right, and then roll them up or fold them up, whatever they do. The corporals, on the other hand, and the palls and purificators, which come into contact with the sacred species, there's a special washing method for this. And generally how it's done is they'll set up 3 large basins, fill them up with water, and then a cleric, so he's got to be a subdeacon or higher, will actually take all these things, put them in the first bowl, and then rinse them out, put them in the second bowl, rinse them out, put them in the third bowl of water and rinse them out, and then let them dry, and then turn them over for laundering to ladies. So this is a special purification method that they use. And then that water, now here in the ritual for ordaining a subdeacon, it's mentioned to pour them into the baptistry. And they're speaking of the baptismal font because there's supposed to be a compartment in the baptismal font that drains directly to the ground. And that little area in the ground is lined usually with gravel, or it may just be open pit with dirt under the ground. It does not go into the sewer. And that's technically it's called a sacrarium. You used to hear the term sacrarium for the special sink in the sacristy. Technically it's the piscina or sink that drains into the sacrarium. But nevertheless, that's what they just call it. They call that special sink the sacrarium. Well, and this is because in olden times, you didn't have sacrariums necessarily in the sacristy itself. That's what the common practice is today, but they didn't change this admonition of the bishop's speech to the subdeacons to reflect that. In older churches, especially like in England, they would often have built into the credence alcove a little sacrarium that drained into the ground, but those are so small, they might not be able to take up all the water, whereas the one in the baptistry could. Today, you won't see them pouring this water normally into the baptismal font anymore. It just goes into the sacrarium that's in the sacristy. So again, just to reiterate, any linen that has come into contact with the sacred species, so the corporal obviously because the host is resting on it, the pall because it's resting on top of the chalice. In fact, sometimes it's very rare, but it can happen where a little of the precious blood somehow ended up on the rim of the chalice lip, and you'll even see it on the underside of the pall, and that will have to be cleansed. The purificator, of course, very possibly could come into contact because it's being used after the consecration. So all these things must undergo this special rinsing ritual, you might say, before they undergo normal laundering. There is actually a missionary dispensation for the laity to undergo this purification system. Normally it's supposed to be a cleric, and normally they want a cleric in major order, subdiaconate, and higher. That's not always possible. So the church has, for missionary territories, allowed people to be assigned or commissioned to do this. It's very rare for this to happen, and it shouldn't be done unless there's an absolute necessity. And this is because maybe even the priests themselves wouldn't have time or the ability to do this, because it does take some time to get this done. All right, let's move on to some other linens that are associated with the altar cloths. So we have one of the altar cloths you may have heard about before is called the chrismale or cere cloth. And the word chrismale is taken from the word chrism, sacred chrism, the holy oil, whereas the word cere is Latin for wax. Now, this is a linen cloth that is just the size of the mensa usually, so from edge to edge or corner to corner. And the one side of the cloth, the underside part of the cloth, has actually been coated in wax. And this was done because on a newly consecrated altar, it's just been anointed with chrism over the whole part of the altar, the top of the altar. And while it has been wiped down, there is a possibility some remnants of that chrism still remains. And so as a precaution against the chrism possibly staining the actual altar cloths, this chrismale cloth would be placed down, and then after a certain amount of time, it could be a couple months, maybe even longer, then the chrismale cloth would be removed, the racks would be scraped, and actually it could be burned or it could be buried, because in case there was any chrism on there, and then the cloth would be cleansed, laundered, and it could be then used as an ordinary altar cloth. The chrismale cloth or cherry cloth was often used in olden times as well too, permanently on an altar, especially in countries that were had very damp weather conditions. And this was done to insulate the top of the stone mensa, which could, because it's so large, it could condensate water on there, or liquid humidity, which would then dampen the altar cloths. And I've actually heard of this happening in some countries where there might be a lot of humidity. And remember, churches in olden times, they didn't have air conditioning, let alone even central heating. So they're essentially these big, giant, open to the weather condition type of buildings. Maybe they had some braziers burning in certain places, but that was about it. Once again, if you'd like to learn more about this really fascinating topic, again, I would suggest to you The Liturgical Altar by Jeffrey Webb, which is available at my website, romanitaspress.com. Also laundering altar linens, which is available from Angelus Press, angeluspress.org. Tune in next week for another show of learning about the Roman liturgy. Until then, I'm your host, Louis Tofari of Romanitas Press. Take care, and God bless.
We hope you have enjoyed this week's edition of Learning About the Roman Liturgy with Louis Tofari. To learn more, visit Mr. Tofari's website, romanitaspress.com, and join us here each Thursday as Mr. Tofari talks about the rubrics, the liturgy, and the traditions of the Roman Catholic faith, right here on Magnificat Radio at magnificatmedia.com, living our traditional Catholic faith.